Well, welcome again to everyone today. Good to have you with us. Good to have you on another of God's holy days. I've referred to the next several months as the dark season, a time devoid of any of God's great annual holy days. But, as has been pointed out, there are plenty of holidays to observe or participate in during the next several months. If you think about it, these holidays very much involve our children. Often when I ask people why they participate in many of these holidays, what do they say? We do it for the children. We love our children, and we do it for them. And I'm sure they do. Parents want what's best for their children. When parents see others around them observing these holidays, there's a natural tendency to join them. They often feel that having their children involved in these holidays shows that they love and care for their children. Which holidays am I talking about? Well, there's a night when children dress up in costumes and parade around the streets collecting candy and other treats. Most parents, it seems, faithfully take their young children out to do this year after year. Then, there's a holiday when children wake up to find presents under a tree. Their little faces light up when they see that Santa Claus has given them presents or rewards for being good. Around 3 months later, children will hunt for hidden Easter eggs and get treats of chocolate bunnies and eggs as well as Peeps. But this time, they're not delivered by Santa Claus or people they may have tricked into giving them a treat, but rather by the Easter Bunny. Now, the question's often asked, what's wrong with just having some good, clean fun by celebrating these holidays? The children really seem to enjoy it. In fact, most Christians seem to participate in Halloween, Christmas, Easter, as well as all the other holidays. Most Christian churches teach that we should have our children participate in these holidays as good, clean Christian fun. And at this time of year, many churches seem to be planning for their next annual holiday. What is it? Well, in fact, they're preparing right now for trunk or treat. Trunk or treat. Many churches today participate in a version of trick or treat. Now, they call it trunk or treat. Those of us who are a little older are likely very familiar with trick or treating. I noted this when I was a child. But some of us may not be familiar with trunk or treat. I'd like to read part of an article I found on reference.com. It's entitled, "What is Trunk or Treat?" by a staff writer. It was last updated March 24, 2020. Quote, according to NPR, trunk or treating was initially an alternative to Halloween night that was introduced by churches. However, many non-religious groups and communities have adopted trunk or treating in place of traditional trick-or-treating on Halloween. Trunk or treating is much like classic trick-or-treating, where kids still dress up in costume and ask for candy. Trunk or treating is a version of trick-or-treating, but instead of children going door to door to collect candy, they go from trunk to trunk. Trunk or treating typically takes place in church or school parking lots. However, with trunk or treating, issues with walking from house to house or encountering a stranger are diminished because the event is held in a parking lot with parents and guardians present. End quote. So the difference between trick or treat and trunk or treat is that trunk or treat is done in a small area which is considered safer for the children. But the children still dress up in costumes and ask for candy or treats. So whether we call it trick or treat or trunk or treat, it's still the same thing. It is, of course, a celebration of Halloween. I checked the website of a church I used to attend as a child. I wanted to see if they had plans for Halloween this year. I was curious. What did I find? Well, yes, they did indeed plan to observe Halloween this year. In fact, they're urging their members to bring their vehicles to the church parking lot, then decorate them and hand out candy to the children. And of course, they call this trunk or treat. But it does seem a bit odd to me that a church that claims to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ would observe Halloween in any way, shape, or form. Why do these churches do it? Some say it's a way to attract more people into the church. Does that sound like a good plan? What do you think? Does participating in things that are not of God lead people to God? Well, notice something else on that church's website. Mixed in with the text about their trunk or treat event, there was some clip art of candy, which would of course seem normal for this type of event. That sounds reasonable. But there's also clip art of children in costumes with bags in their hands. I suppose that would also seem appropriate to illustrate this event, since children do go around in costume with bags in their hands. But what kinds of costumes were these children wearing on the church's website? Who were the children on this church's website promoting by the costumes they wore? What example is this church setting for its children? Let me give us a hint. See if you can guess who I'm talking about here. One of the children had 2 horns on his head, and he was carrying a pitchfork. Any ideas? Obviously, this is representing Satan, or at least a demon. There's also a female witch and a male witch, or a wizard. Would Jesus Christ dress his children up as witches and a devil and have them collect candy? And do so in honor of the holiday that we call Halloween? Is that something that we as followers of Jesus Christ would expect him to do, or that we should do? Well, if not, who's to blame? The children? Well, the children are only doing what their parents teach them to do. So are the parents to blame? Well, who's telling parents to dress their kids up in costumes, suggesting devils and witches as examples as they ask for candy and treats? Who did that? Well, in this case, the church did. This is something that is promoted as good, clean fun to the followers of Jesus Christ. But but that's what's happened to many churches today. They don't teach about the kingdom of God anymore, but they will teach us to dress as devils and witches and celebrate holidays that have their origins in paganism and the occult. So it's no wonder that church attendance is waning today. And this started long before the pandemic. So might that have something to do with it? Let's go ahead and look at the second holiday we mentioned earlier. What about Christmas? We know that Christmas, like Halloween, originated with an ungodly celebration. This time, it was a Saturnalia, originating with the worship of the false god Saturn. In addition to the other traditions of the Saturnalia, we find ourselves once again giving our children treats or presents to keep this tradition going. Now, most people have no idea where the Yule logs come from, or the mistletoe, or the gift exchanges. Now, some will try to tell us that the tradition of giving each other gifts came from the Magi giving gifts. But they gave their gifts to Jesus Christ, their King, not to each other. Jeremiah 10, verse 1. I know some of us are very familiar with that. Jeremiah 10, verse 1. The Christmas tree itself originated in the pagan worship of other gods. We'll see here in Jeremiah that God does not want us to worship as the pagans or the heathen do. Again, that's Jeremiah 10, verse 1. Hear ye the word which the Lord speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen. Here God tells us not to learn the ways of the worshipers of other gods, or not to do the things they do when we intend to worship him. Verse 3. By the way, you might note that this will be describing a Christmas tree, and this is an example of a custom of the heathen, one that occurred a long, long time ago, long before Christmas. Jeremiah 10, verse 3. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cuts a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They deck it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must need to be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither also is it in them to do good. Forasmuch as there is none like unto you, O Lord, you are great, and your name is great in might. The ever-popular Christmas tree was an idol long ago to the heathen. And really, the customs of Christmas were always a mystery to me. But there's one thing that really puzzles me. How often do we see Christians pray? How many times do we see them thank God for the food they're about to eat? Or to thank God for their health? Actually, for all the blessings God has given them. How often do we see that? You know, God's given us our very existence. He's given us everything. But at Christmas time, when the children are so excited about the toys and other treats they received, you know what they look like, right? They're really excited. Do they thank God for their gifts? Do they thank God for their blessings? The answer is no. They thank Santa Claus. Why? Because their parents teach them to. The same Christian parents that give God credit for the food they eat, the blessings they have, even their very existence, they teach their children that the things they ask for, the blessings they receive, don't come from our God at all, but rather a counterfeit of Jesus Christ called Santa Claus. And where do Christian parents get the idea to have Christmas trees and Santa Claus? Well, again, the churches themselves promote it. The parents get it from their parents and from today's church. Jeremiah 16, verse 19, if you would. That's Jeremiah chapter 16, and we'll begin in verse 19. So actually, believe it or not, these traditions came from churches in the first place, and were taught to our parents by their parents. But these traditions originated in the church. But this really shouldn't come as a surprise to those who know their Bibles, because the prophet Jeremiah foretold this would happen a very long time ago. Again, Jeremiah 16, verse 19. O Lord, my strength and my fortress, and my refuge in the day of affliction, the Gentiles shall come unto you from the ends of the earth, and shall say, Surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. As usual, Bible prophecy is very accurate, because that's exactly what's happened to us. We've inherited lies, etc., and many came from churches. Let's take a brief look at Easter. You know, the pagan Saturnalia festival was renamed the Mass of Christ, or Christmas, which is actually a bit odd because the Mass, I believe, would relate to the death and not one's birth. But anyway, the festival of Easter, with its bunny rabbits and Easter eggs, was not renamed as were other pagan celebrations. It continued to be observed as, well, Easter. What does the word Easter mean? Well, from BibleStudyTools.com, Easter is originally a Saxon word, Joster, denoting a goddess of the Saxons, in honor of whom sacrifices were offered about the time of Passover. The celebration of Easter is actually the worship of the false goddess, a fertility goddess, of course, with her eggs and rabbits. We'll talk more about that next spring. But the name Easter is one of the actual names of that false goddess, depending on the culture, of course. And oddly, the name of Easter wasn't changed to make it more Christian sounding. It was kept. Exodus 23. That's Exodus chapter 23, if you would. And we'll go to verse 13. That's Exodus 23, 13. We know from the first few commandments that God doesn't like us worshiping or even having anything to do with any false gods or goddesses. We're not to even speak the names of other gods and goddesses. And we'll see that right here in Exodus chapter 23, verse 13. Here's what it says. And in all things that I have said unto you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of your mouth. I'd like to reread that in the easy-to-read version. It says, be sure that you obey all these laws. Don't worship false gods. You should not even speak their names. Yet, that's exactly what many churches teach us to do. And of course, Easter is said to represent the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's observed annually, but occurs neither on the day of the week nor the date of Christ's actual resurrection. But churches have their children participate in Easter egg hunts and Easter egg rolls, things that have, of course, nothing to do with Jesus Christ, of course. And many churches also have Easter sunrise services. Ezekiel Chapter 8. That's Ezekiel Chapter 8. We'll go to verse 14. I know many parents often get up early in the morning and take their children to this Easter morning sunrise service. Now here in Ezekiel Chapter 8, Ezekiel was shown many things that God considers to be abominations to him. Before we continue, let's stop for a second. What is an abomination? Anybody know? The word abomination is H8441 in Strong's Dictionary. It's toibah. According to Strong's, it means, the definition of abomination, it means something disgusting morally, an abhorrence, especially idolatry or an idol. The abominations mentioned here in Ezekiel are something that God does not like. But when we get to verse 13, there are yet more and even greater abominations than those listed in the first 12 verses of Ezekiel chapter 8. Look at those later if you want. Let's go to verse 13 and these even greater abominations. So Ezekiel 8, verse 13. He said also to me, turn you yet again. You shall see greater abominations that they do. Well, these are even greater abominations. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Now, we'll talk more about this in the spring as well. Let's go ahead in verse 15. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn you yet again, and you shall see greater abominations than these. So these abominations are disgusting things, are getting worse as we go through this chapter. The next abomination we'll read about is yet a greater abomination to God. This is a very great abomination, apparently. What is it? Verse 16. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord. Now, what were these men doing? Let's continue. And their faces toward the east, and they worshiped the sun toward the east. These men, these 25 men, were worshiping the sun as it rose in the east. They weren't worshiping God as he'd asked to be worshiped, that's for sure. Rather, they were engaged in the worshiping in the manner of the heathen. This was a sunrise service. How did God feel about this abomination? Was he okay with it? Verse 17. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence, and returned to provoke me to anger. And lo, they put the branch to their nose. Or as the contemporary English version says, I'll read that to you here, same verse. God said, Ezekiel, it's bad enough that the people of Judah are doing these disgusting things, but they've also spread violence and injustice everywhere in Israel and have made me very angry. They have disgraced and insulted me in the worst possible way. Okay, verse 18. How does God really feel about this? Okay, verse 18. Therefore, will I also deal in fury. My eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them. God was not happy about this sunrise service. Exodus chapter 32. If you would, let's go over to Exodus chapter 32. We'll begin right in verse 1. I'd like to look at one more place in our Bibles where people claim to be worshiping the true God, but do so in the manner that others worship their false gods. Again, that's Exodus 32, beginning in verse 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron, and said to him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we know not what is become of him. Now, the translation in the King James here isn't maybe the best. But the people wanted to make gods. These are basically idols. But the word gods here is actually Elohim. The people's intent was to worship the one true God. Let's look at this in verse 5. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. The word Lord here is translated from Yehovah. They were having a feast to the true God, but doing so at the time of their choosing, and worshiping the true God in the manner of the heathen or the pagans. In this case, by creating an idol representing God. They were worshiping God, but was God pleased? Well, in verse 27, God commanded the Levites to slay those who were disobedient to him. Let's look at verse 28. How'd that go? How'd that work out for them? That's Exodus 32, verse 28. And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses. And there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. So around 3,000 men were killed as a result of worshiping God in a manner that others worshiped their false gods. So I believe we can safely say that our true God doesn't like it when we try to bring other gods and goddesses into the worship of him, or when we worship him in the manner that others worship their false gods. So why do so many churches teach their congregations the ways of the heathen? Why don't they just follow Jesus Christ and the example that he set for us? Let's get back to the children. To entice the children to observe Halloween, what do churches do? Like the rest of the world, they tempt them with candy and with treats, right? And of course, some we see actually encourage them to dress up as demons and witches. Hard for me to believe, but what about Christmas? How do we keep our children interested in this holiday? Well, by giving them things, toys or treats. And what do all those toys and treats at Christmas time entice the children to do? They entice the children to believe in Santa Claus rather than the one and only true God. And how do we entice children into believing in the Easter Bunny or to participate in pagan practices like dyeing eggs with candy? So, again, we actually bribe our children to look away from Jesus Christ and have them focus their attention on Easter bunnies, Santa Claus, anything else. We're using candy and other treats to entice our children to ignore Jesus Christ and instead go after other gods. In short, we're enticing them to sin. Matthew chapter 18. If you would, let's turn to Matthew chapter 18. Again, we'll start in verse 1. That'll make it easy for us. That's Matthew chapter 18. Now here, his disciples were asking Jesus about who would be the greatest in God's kingdom. But Jesus began talking about little children. Again, that's Matthew 18, verse 1. At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say unto you, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receives me. Now, I'd like us to look very closely at verse 6, the next verse. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he was drowned in the depth of the sea. Wow. You know, I looked up the weight of a millstone. I was curious. I kept coming up with a figure of over 1,000 pounds. In fact, most said up to 3,300 pounds. So, who would like to have over 1,000 pounds put around our neck and be thrown into the sea? That sounds horrible. But Jesus says that would actually be preferable to what? What would be worse? Having a millstone around our neck and being thrown into the sea would be preferable to the fate of a person who would offend the little child that believed in Jesus Christ. Now, we certainly don't want to offend the child if that causes us to have a fate even worse than having that millstone around our neck and being thrown into the sea. So, what does it actually mean to offend a child? Do we know? Let's take a look at the meaning of the word offend here in Matthew 18, verse 6. You might want to look this up in your Strong's dictionary or other Bible dictionary, but the word offend is G4624 in Strong's. It's scandalizo in the Greek. It means to scandalize, to entrap, to trip up, to entice to sin. When churches promote dressing up as devils and witches and asking for candy, are they enticing young children to unwittingly sin? When churches condone telling children that they should thank Santa Claus for their presents, rather than the true God who provides everything to us, is that enticing our children to sin? When the church promotes Easter with the dyeing of eggs and Easter egg hunts and the worship of the rising sun at Easter sunrise services, is that enticing our children to sin? 2 Peter chapter 2. If you would turn to 2 Peter chapter 2, we'll make it easy again. We'll start right in verse 1. That's 2 Peter 2, verse 1. Now, trained pastors are very well aware of the things I've been talking about, yet they seem to insist on perpetuating these abominations, as God calls them, to us and to our children. That might seem incredible to many of us. But again, let's go to 2 Peter 2, verse 1. Now, I like to read the next three verses using the easy-to-read version of the Bible. So, then I'll go back to the King James afterward. But let's read this. I'll read this in the easy-to-read version. Again, 2 Peter 2, verse 1. In the past, there were false prophets among God's people. It is the same now. You will have some false teachers in your group. They will teach things that are wrong, ideas that will cause people to be lost. And they will teach in a way that will be hard for you to see that they are wrong. They will even refuse to follow the Master who bought their freedom, and so they will quickly destroy themselves. Many people will follow them and the morally wrong things they do. And because of them, others will say bad things about the way of truth we follow. You may recall a short time ago, I actually had a pastor tell me that we should not try to keep any of God's commandments. That God was not pleased when we try to keep his own commandments. That's true. They do indeed say bad things about the way of truth that we follow. Verse 3. These false teachers only want your money, so they will use you by telling you things that are not true. But the judgment against these false teachers has been ready for a long time, and they will not escape God, who will destroy them. And we can read the same thing in Jude verse 4, by the way. But I'd like to point out that the phrase destroy them in 2 Peter 2 verse 3 is really better translated that they will be held for judgment. God is indeed merciful. Let's wrap this up today. So, after completing God's holy day season, we now enter the time of man's holidays. Holidays that have little to do with Jesus Christ and much more about pagan practices. Children are enticed to follow the customs of these holidays by being promised candy and toys. The parents just love seeing their children's faces light up when they get candy, presents, and other things that they love. But they are often unwittingly drawing their children away from Jesus Christ and toward pagan ideas and practices, or abominations, as God calls them. Romans 12 verse 2. Romans 12 verse 2, if you would. Romans chapter 12. This time we'll start in verse 2. There is the way of God, and there is the way of the world. For years now, it seems that many Christian churches are going the way of the world. They draw closer to worldly things and farther away from godly things. But what should we do? What should we do? Again, that's Romans 12 verse 2. Where we're told, be not conformed to this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We're not to be conformed to this world. We're not to be like the rest of the world. In fact, we're to be God's peculiar people. What about our children? Let's turn to Proverbs 22 verse 6 to end today. That's Proverbs 22 verse 6, and that'll end our sermon for today. Proverbs 22 verse 6. Should we allow our churches to teach our children the ways of the world? The ways of the heathen? The ways that are an abomination to God? Or should we teach them what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God? Don't let others steer us down the wrong path. We know what Jesus says about whoso shall offend one of these little ones, or in other words, entice them to sin. We certainly don't want to suffer that fate. So let's teach our children to worship in spirit and in truth. Again, Proverbs 22 verse 6. And it reads, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Or as the contemporary English version reads, teach your children right from wrong, and when they grow, they will still do right.